Hello and welcome to this video in which I'm going to tell you all about what I think are the top 5 hand sewing stitches. I'm going to go through each of the stitches in great detail, showing you exactly how to do it with really good close-ups. I'm going to show you different examples for which the stitch can be used and share as many tips and tricks along the way as I can. So if you're a seasoned stitcher, then hopefully this will be a great refresher. And if you're completely new to hand sewing, then hopefully this will be really comprehensive to get you started on your journey. So if you're sewing along with me at home, gather up your needle, thread, scissors, maybe a thimble, some pins, and let's get sewing. So the first stitch we're going to look at is a very simple running stitch, and this is often the first stitch that we learn when we are starting our hand stitching journey. I use running stitch a lot as a decorative stitch actually, so you can see it here. I use it in quilting, and I've done some big stitch quilting here, so it's a really nice one to learn for that. You can use it for joining pieces together, but I'm going to demonstrate it for quilting. When I'm doing a running stitch for decorative purposes, I'm often using a decorative thread, a thicker thread. So I like to use this 12 weight fruity thread by Wonderful, and I'm using a bigger needle. I'm not using the milliner's needles that I tend to use for most other types of stitches. I use a chenille needle or an embroidery needle, and I'm actually going to use a sharps needle. It's one of the certain stitch needles because they have a mark on the end that helps you to evenly space out your running stitches, so I find this really helps. So you can use that as a guide to help you space out your stitches, and I'll show you how. I also use my thimble when I do quilting or running stitch. Before I get started, if you're a beginner to this, it's really good to rule a line for where you want your stitches to go. To do this, I like to use the Air Erasable pen by Sewline, or you could use a heat erasable pen, but because we're going to stitch it straight away, I usually reach for this pen. It writes really nicely on the fabric. So now I've done that, I've chosen to rule mine 1/4 of an inch away from the edge. I'm just going to put my needle in about 1/2 an inch away from where I want to start. I'm going to start on that point, and this is just so I can bury my tail because I don't want the thread to be on the back, so I'm burying it between the layers. But you wouldn't start every running stitch like this, it's just in this case I'm doing it on a quilted piece. And all you need to do is just go in a stitch length forward, and you decide how big you want your stitches to be. In this case I'm using my mark on my needle, so I'm bringing my needle back a little bit, ready to make the next stitch, but I'm bringing it up to that red point so I know my next one will always be the same size if I do it that way. So again, I'm lining up the end of the red mark, so my stitches are going to be this length. I'm lining it up there, so I go back down, and in this case I'm going through all the layers because I'm quilting it, and forward again. And when you speed up with a running stitch, you can take a few stitches at a time depending on how long of a needle you're working with. So the idea is that we're making our stitches the same length as each other, and also the gaps in between, so that everything is consistent. Now with everything, I always say don't worry too much about it being perfect. I definitely wouldn't undo any stitches if they weren't the perfect length, because I think that takes the joy away. Just each time you make one, just try and make them as uniform as possible, but don't get so wrapped up in it that it takes the joy away, because we're not going for perfection here. However you do them, it will look lovely. So that's our running stitch. Now what I've got here, I've got some wadding because I like to stitch into wadding. It just gives my piece a bit of extra support. And I've got 2 pieces of fabric that I want to join together. So I've got this lovely one I showed you last week here. I've just got it in position and I'm just going to pin it in place. And I want to add this patch. I'm making a bit of a slow stitch book and I'm just adding different things and just testing it out. So I want this patch to be here. I'm going to join it along here with a back stitch. I could do it with a running stitch, but I like doing a back stitch because it feels more secure. So you can see better, I'm going to use thicker thread. I think I'll use blue this time. It's a lovely blue colour. I'm actually using a chenille 24 needle, which I usually use just for embroidery, but I'm using it because it has a wider eye for getting the thread through and a sharp point for going through the layers. I've ruled my line on. It's quite faint, but it is there, and I'm going to work from right to left. I've got a knot in the end of my thread, and because it's here and I haven't even got the backing fabric on yet, I'm not going to worry about the knot, but I'm going to come up a stitch length in from the edge and then go back down right to the edge there, and then I'm bringing my needle up a stitch length in front on that line, and I want to really accurately get it on that line because that will keep my stitching nice and straight. So next I'm going to go back into the same hole that this stitch is made in and forward a stitch length again. So always taking one step back and one step forward. And you get a stitch that looks a bit like what a sewing machine would produce, and it's strong as well. It's really strong because each stitch is reinforced by going back and then forward again because the thread is carried underneath. Let's have a look at the back. It's difficult to see the back because of the wadding, but you can see how the stitches go over each other. So this is great for joining pieces together like this. So when back stitch is used in this way to join 2 pieces of fabric together, these stitches are not going to show because when we take our pin out and we flip it to the right side and give it a press, our stitches don't come through on this side. However, if you were using back stitch as a decorative stitch, because we use it in embroidery as well, then that's when it would show because it's decorative, and so that's when you would just need to take a bit more care about making your stitches look as uniform as you can. But in this case, with them not going to show at all on the front of my work, I'm not worried about them being perfectly spaced. So that's the back stitch. Now when the sun goes down, I can stitch right into the evening really comfortably thanks to my high definition light from Serious Readers, and they have very kindly sponsored today's video. I've been using their Serious lights for many years now, and they just make such a difference compared to not stitching underneath one. And that's because the lights in the high definition range use something called daylight wavelength technology, and what that does is replicate the daylight spectrum as closely as technically possible. And that creates this light that feels so natural, and it's really lovely and relaxing to work under, relaxing on the eyes, and helps to reduce eye strain as well. I have the cordless tabletop model here, which is really portable. I can just pick it up and move it to wherever I want it to be. I also have the heavyweight base just to really ensure that it's not going to fall over, and I think it's fantastic. If you'd like to find out more, there's a link in the description box, and you can use my offer code, which is Emma, and that will get you £150 off a high definition light and also free UK delivery. So the next stitch we're going to look at is the whip stitch. Now I actually don't use a thimble for whip stitch. because I don't push the needle with my finger when I'm whip stitching. That's just my technique. I know everyone is different. So whip stitch is the stitch that we typically use for English paper piecing. Some people do use a ladder stitch or a flat back stitch, but typically the most common one is a whip stitch. There are other reasons for using a whip stitch as well, not just English paper piecing. You might want to oversew some edges of something and join it pieces together. It's a joining stitch rather than a decorative one. It's a great stitch because you can join pieces edge to edge. There's no overlap. They are butted up right next to each other, so it's great for any instances in which you might need to do that, and English paper piecing is one of them. So for doing a whip stitch, I'm using a milliner's needle, and we always sew in the same direction from left to right, right to left, front to back, back to front, whichever direction you like to sew in. And you'll notice that I sew away from me. Some people sew towards themselves. It doesn't matter, so long as you're always going from the same side to the opposite side. It doesn't matter which way round you do it. The idea with a whip stitch is to just catch the tiniest bite of the fabric. So you can see here my needle is going just in that fold ever so slightly. I'm not too close to the top, but I'm not digging in too far down either. We want to make our stitches relatively shallow, but also really close together. Another important part of the whip stitch is keeping the stitches straight. If you put your needle in at an angle, they're going to show up more on the front, and that's the aim with a whip stitch when it comes to English paper piecing, is to not have them show on the front. Again, not something to obsess over or worry about, but you'll just get more success if you manage to keep your needle as straight as you can, making the stitches nice and shallow, not digging in too deep. For spacing them out, we don't want any gaping and gaps when we pull our piece. We want it to be nice and strong. So I'm just stitching probably about 1/8 of an inch apart, always going from front to back. Like I said, you can go in any direction, and I hold my needle and I push it through like that, so I don't need a thimble. And with English paper piecing, when I'm doing this stitch, I always do a locking knot at every corner. I'm using a fine thread as well because I find that gets really good results and will show up less on the front of the work. So I'm here now. I'm just going to reposition my shapes. I'm not using paper, but you can do this with paper. It makes no difference. You can fold it. I'm using hexiform. And I'm going back into my piece again at the corner and just making those shallow, straight stitches. So you can see when I'm done, that is the whip stitch. Barely visible on the front and barely visible on the back as well. So that's our whip stitch. Okay, so the next one I'm going to show you is one of my absolute favourites, and it is the ladder stitch, and I think this stitch is really magical. Now in my Quilt As You Go quilt, I'm using the ladder stitch to join these hexagons together. It's another stitch that helps things to join up edge to edge with no overlap, so it's brilliant for that. This is the Blossom Carry Case, which is one of my new patterns, and this also uses a ladder stitch to join the edge here to the lid and the bottom to this side as well. So it's a really useful stitch for joining things together. It can be used in a variety of different ways, so let me show you how to do it. I'm going to use this blue thread so you can see what I'm doing, and I'm using chenille needle, chenille 24. I do typically use a thicker thread for ladder stitches because we're going to give it a pull, so we don't want to risk any thread that might snap. So I go for the 12 weight threads usually in just a neutral colour, but I'll do this one in blue so you can see. So these are the two edges that we're going to join with a ladder stitch. So first of all I need to bury my thread tail because I don't want that to show on the front or the back. And then I'm just going to go right into that corner and just make a little stitch to secure everything. So you can see my thread is coming out here. Now with a ladder stitch we want to work opposite sides, so we've got the front here which is the peach colour and the teal colour on the back, so we want to be alternating between the two. Now again we're working with quite a shallow stitch where we're not going to dig in deep, we're just working in this fold of the fabric. So because my thread is coming out on the teal, I'm going to go into the peach and just make a small straight stitch in the fold of the fabric. So I want it to be right up there in the fold of the fabric. I'm going to make them quite small because I find that gives a much better result overall. So I pull my needle through, and I'm not worried about seeing the thread at this stage because the magic will happen at the end. So where this thread is coming out in the peach, I'm going to go directly opposite but in the teal and make my next stitch just under the fold of the fabric, push through. Again, you might want to use your thimble for this. When I'm doing a lot of ladder stitch I do like to have my thimble. So again I'm coming out in the teal, so directly opposite in the peach. I'm going in and making a stitch length, and you can see the little stitches start to show on the top of the work and they look like the rungs of a ladder, which is where the name ladder stitch comes from. You're essentially creating a ladder by alternating from one to another. The beauty of the ladder stitch and the way in which it's different to a whip stitch is that you won't see any of these stitches once the stitch is completed, so it's completely invisible, which makes it great for things like this quilt or the sewing case that I showed you before. You could use it for English paper piecing, but personally I find it far too fiddly and it just takes the enjoyment out of it for English paper piecing. For me, a whip stitch works well for English paper piecing, and this stitch, I use it for bigger things like this quilt and the sewing case, etc. But it's all down to personal preference. There's no reason why you couldn't use it if you wanted to. So really the key with the ladder stitch is small stitches, keeping them as straight as possible, alternating from one side to the other. So at the moment it looks very visible and a bit of a mess, but the beauty comes when we get to the end. So I'm at the end now and I haven't made a knot or anything to fasten it off, and I'm just going to lay everything flat so you can see how we've got the rungs of the ladder and we've got a gap, so nothing has been closed up yet. When you get to the end of your row of stitching for a ladder stitch, you then need to pull, and when you pull, the gap will close. You can see how it draws everything in. And gives a really nice finish where we can't see any stitches and everything is lying really flat. So what I would do now is just take a stitch between the corners, make a knot and fasten it off with burying my thread tail. So just make sure everything is nice and tight before I do that. So the final stitch that we are going to work on is an applique stitch. So first of all, I'm just preparing my applique piece. So it's this little cottage design. I have one of these on my quilt already here, but I made another one because this is a little pattern that is over on my Patreon page, and I made another one, and I thought it would be nice to add another one to my quilt anyway. So I've got these tiny applique pins, and I find these to be brilliant. It reduces the chances of your stitches getting caught on the pins, so I like to use these to secure my piece, and I'm just taking the time to make sure it's straight before I begin. Applique stitch is super useful. I used it to applique down the windows and doors in my pattern for the Little House Notion pouch. I use it all the time. I used it on my hexagon storage basket to add the hexagons around the edge. Use it on my hexagon sewing case to secure this hexagon design. So I also use it in the basket to stitch the flower on, so it's a stitch that's super useful and you'll just use it all the time. So I'm using some applique needles size 10 Big Eye. That just means they're a bit easier to thread. And applique needles are just a bit shorter than the milliner's needles, but I often use milliner's as well, just whatever I have to hand. Normally I choose a thread like this, something that's going to really blend in to both what you're appliquing and the background fabric, but so you can see what I'm doing a bit better, I'm going to use a pink thread. It's still the fine Wonderfill Invisifil thread, the very fine 100 weight thread, but I'm just going to choose it in a colour just so you can see what I'm doing a bit better. So I have nothing on the back at the moment, so I can start by bringing my needle up straight away from the back. Tied a knot in the end of my thread, and just bringing it up till I can feel it hit that knot. And I'm bringing it up in the house that I'm appliquing, and then I'm going to go straight down, directly opposite but into the backing fabric. Now what I can do is, before I put my needle all the way down, I can slide it to come out in the house for where I want my next stitch to be. So come up and then again go back down, directly opposite but in the backing fabric, and then slide my needle across to come back up again. Now I really love this stitch because it is, once you get the hang of it, it's really easy to make your stitches seem really quite invisible. Now they are showing because I'm using pink, but if you use a thread that is going to blend with your fabric, then you really can barely see them at all, and that's because the longest part of the stitch is actually on the back of the work. It's the diagonal, so as we go down here, if you go down directly opposite where you came up, you're making your stitches really short. Now as we slide the needle to come out in the next one diagonally, the thread is going to be underneath, which is what makes the stitch barely visible on top, and it just gives a really nice finish to whatever you're appliquing. I'm working from right to left because I'm right-handed, but you might find it more comfortable to work left to right or whatever direction, it doesn't matter. The key elements of this stitch are making sure you make your stitches on top of the fabric really short, and that is going to give you the best results. Any little bits that are poking out, just tuck them in with the needle, and then off we go. So there is the applique stitch all done. So that's it for today's video. Thank you so much for watching. If you have any questions about any of the stitches, then do leave them in the comments, and massive thank you for being here. Really appreciate it, and I'll see you really soon with something else. Take care. Bye bye.